His daddy can't talk.
Ooh, look who knows so much, huh? Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Please open his mouth. Now, mostly dead is slightly alive. Now, all dead, well, with all dead, there's usually only one thing that you can do.
What's that?
Go through his clothes and look for loose change.
Welcome back to The Spark. Tonight we have a returning guest from Project Archivist and friend of the show, Shelly.
Hi.
We're going to be talking about The Dead this evening. Well, actually this afternoon or whenever you're listening to it.
Yep.
So, just like the last episode of The Spark, it's a little bit of a deviation from the original format of the show, but just like the last time when Chuck was on, we're going to try and do a stream of consciousness of just information on the dead and why the Western civilization and Eastern civilization, and pretty much anybody that's not Americanized, look at it as different than the rest of the world.
Yeah. You know, it is interesting because it's the most pronounced I've ever seen it is in America. And I'm talking North America.
Yeah, it's
so
we're compared to the rest of the world. I mean, I realize that we fancy ourselves civilized, but more civilized areas of the world seem to have a vastly different view on the dead than we do.
Right, and in fact, one of the most interesting indicators of that I have noticed in what little I've traveled is how we take care of graves, for example. So if you go to Germany and go to a graveyard, for example, I went to a tiny little chapel in this little village in northern Germany, and there was a priest that is paid by the village to take care of these graves, and they had little borders, and they were like little gardens set up. One had this beautiful tree in it, an angel statue. There were, like, as disturbing as this may sound, some herb gardens and flowers, but they're very carefully tended to. It's a very small one. But you've probably encountered this, and this is especially prevalent in the Western United States, where if you want a standing gravestone, it costs more. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is they can't run the lawnmower over it. They have to actually stop and tend to the grave. We have this exceptionally sterile, almost capitalistic view of how to take care of graveyards and take care of our dead that just, there's no intimacy to it. There's no personalization. That's where the bodies go and away from the rest of us. And let's make sure we can ride over it with the riding lawnmower.
It's kind of painful when you really think about it because, you know, we claim to value life in this country quite a bit. And
we do.
You know, for all manner of reasons, whether it be religious, spiritual, ethnic, or, you know, anywhere in between that spectrum. We claim to value life, but as soon as the person's gone, we just want to be able to have the memories, and mostly just good memories. So we tend throughout the years to sterilize, you know, in a lot of instances, what actually happened between us and the person that's departed.
Oh, sure. And that's, I'm sure people can understand that's part of the grieving process and the psychology of grieving. But another thing, and you and I have talked about this before, is the access to technology that we have now. We're able to preserve a lot of things through video, through photography, through even memorialized Facebook pages, where we can have that person available in a digitized manner. And this is not new. I mean, when post-mortem photography of the Victorian era. Shortly after photography became more widely available, suddenly there were businesses popping up where you could have your loved one, once they died, the whole family could gather for a portrait, and that was the last chance you had to have a piece of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to say, but in your, we spoke about it on one of the Project Archivist episodes about, mourning jewelry and the post-mortem photography, and, just having things that are associated with the person that passed, that now, like you said, you have a Facebook page that's memorialized. One of my best friends, Ice, passed away a few years ago, and his page is still up and running as memorial to him. Right. Whereas, we've had mourning jewelry come through the auction house when I was working for the auction house, necklaces and rings and, headpieces and even artwork there was an entire wreath made from, it was a family's, it was a familial wreath where people from the family would, when someone would pass, the hair or whatever was,
wow.
It was really peculiar because there was me and one other gentleman that worked there, and I use that term gentleman loosely because he was just as big a knucklehead as I am. But when it came through, we were the only two people that actually recognized what it was, and then we just watched the look of horror on the people's faces when we told them what it was. And
yeah, you're just like me, that when you know about these kinds of things, where you're more familiar with the broader spectrum and history of grieving and with mortuary sciences and with dead bodies, like that's how sterile we've become. People are like, oh my God, why do you even know that?
I mean,
well, why don't you?
Yeah, well, the place where the stone that was so generously given to me by you and Chuck,
yes,
I also have jewelry from people that passed. They've given me, I've been given nose rings and earrings and lockets of hair, and I have things from that were given to me by family members. Then they're not my family. These people aren't blood to me that gave me these things. Because
so you're carrying on that tradition.
Trying to. I mean, people walk over and they'll look and they're like, oh, that's a nice, ring. Where's it from? And I'm like, well, it was taken off of a corpse. And they're like, oh, okay. And then they change the subject and they want to walk away, but.
Wait a second. Did you go to the open casket?
No. The nose ring was actually taken from one of my sponsees that unfortunately overdosed and passed away. But yeah, so it happens, especially in this line of life. When he was found, the first thing that his mother asked the paramedics to do was to remove his jewelry, and then it was sanitized and it was placed in a biohazard bag and given to me. So that I'll have it for, well, as long as I have it, which the way I keep things is probably forever. But, I don't want to say that it's a link to the people, but I look at it and I'm like, hey, it's a way to evoke memory. The same way as, these pieces are. People had lockets that they had made, they had fashioned by professional jewelers. They weren't just something that they had some dude make or some woman make. They took the hair and they sent it to a professional jeweler of the time, and they integrated it into the lockets that were used. They'd have filigree that was put around the outside of the pictures of the deceased that was made from the people's hair. It's we hear that's something that we did hear at one time. And in retrospect, It really wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, I was reading some articles about the psychology of death, and particularly in the United States, and what has changed. And you've mentioned this before. I'd encourage any of your listeners to look up the Ask a Mortician, or is that the YouTube channel? Right. And she has gone at length at the topic, talking about how we are separating ourselves from the dead. And no less than 150 years ago, we were making mourning jewelry. We were literally sitting next to corpses while portraits were taken. That's another thing I'd encourage listeners to look up. And if you've got the stomach for it, there's a series of postmortem photography, and some, like BuzzFeed, for example, has articles that are like, "Can you tell which one's dead in the portrait?"
Yep.
Because they would paint eyes on the eyelids. They would come up with these incredible mechanical contractions to actually hold up the corpses into a lifelike pose. I know there was one I was absolutely amazed by. It was the portrait of a firefighter that had passed, and you can actually see where the mortician has reconstructed some of the damage from the fire that he had passed in, and he's actually standing. And they showed the different mechanical parts that holds him up, but you can barely tell he's dead unless you look very closely.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So how did we get this separation? What happened that suddenly it's become more of a industry than it is a personal grieving process to come in contact with the body of the loved one?
See, I think the thing that really aided in that transition period is the fact that it's no longer a burden on the family any more than it has to be. Whereas, like you stated earlier, we have people that will take care of this. They come in, they take the body right from the morgue or from, whatever your area has for the keeping of the bodies, and they'll deliver it to the mortician. Then the mortician meets with the family and they decide what they're going to do with it. They decide on hair and makeup. They decide on the clothing that's going to be worn. All of that stuff at one point was done by family. We used to have times where, the family would wash the body, and you had a
Right.
room in the house that was designated at that point as a waking area, and the bodies were laid out for family and friends to come. And there were times when the bodies were laid out for days on end. All the mirrors were covered with black. The house was in mourning until it was time to bury the person. And when it was wintertime here in New England and in other parts of the country where it stays cold and the ground freezes, your bodies were taken from the house and they were put into a cold storage area. And sometimes that was just in a shed where it was really cold.
Yeah, and that was not abnormal. And one of the articles I was actually reading said that really helps with the psychology of grieving, was to have people come in to your home and for you to be able to cry openly or to mourn openly, and other people acknowledging that. They are able to do that. But now we have this almost stoic approach where, you don't want to cry in public, or you only cry during the service, and then after that, for example, I had a dear friend of mine, she passed at 21 from an overdose, and her mother had someone approach her that they had also lost a child and said, "Look, I'm going to be blunt with you. You have a year. People will acknowledge you, listen to you, understand your grieving for 1 year. And then after that, they don't want to hear it. It's just going to be a thing. They don't want to talk about the funeral. They don't want to talk about how you're grieving. They just move on, and it's always a year for some reason." So I thought that was a curious thing, because that would be like a lifelong heartbreak,
I would imagine.
I would think. But people don't want to hear it, and they don't want to be near the body. So it's very strange to me, especially given, and I spoke about this on a previous podcast, where I was in England, and one of my friends who was Scottish was talking about, I guess his family had moved into a house and they had found bones in the backyard. And my approach is like Stephen King, "Oh my God, you need to move out. There's a dead body on the property. You got to get it blessed. You got to do this." And he looked at me and said, "Why?" Because graveyards go outside of town. Because out here in the West, we have enough room that it's like a whole city block by itself, or out on the outskirts. But like back east, for example, or in England, everywhere's a graveyard.
Literally. Literally.
So yeah, exactly. So why? And I've seen it more pronounced as the further west and the more land you have, people are very averse to even having bodies buried on their property. Whereas it's more natural for Europeans, even like some of the Canadians I talked to didn't feel an aversion. If the body was buried on the property, they'd be like, "Oh, better call the cops just to make
Yeah,
sure."
I mean, it makes perfect sense now when you sit and think about it, where how we have such a detached view of it, whereas people, in the UK, they're. I mean, there's a joke that Eddie Izzard. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a comedian, and
Yeah, I love
he
Eddie
talks
Izzard.
about one of his key phrases all the time is over in England where the history is, because here in the States the town that I live in is literally 100 years older than the entire country as far as when it was founded. So and then I
Right.
look at my town and I'm like, okay, we're really old here, and then I look over across the pond and there's like stones, newer masonry that's older than my town. So
Yeah, exactly. In fact, one time I was just sitting there. I think I was in Rome, and Rome compared to, like, for example, London. London, while it's older, it doesn't compare quite to Rome because it was bombed into the ground and rebuilt no less than 70 some odd years ago. So in Rome, I watched this woman walk up to a fountain, a water fountain. It's been there since Caesar and Julius Caesar, and she's just casually drinking out of it. I'm like, why? That's history. And my aunt goes, it's functional.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
normal for them.
you know, I think the funny thing is when we look across into the other parts of the world, whatever direction you want to go, off our continent, and not even our landmass, just our section of the continent, because you can go
Correct.
either direction, north or south of us, and have vastly different views of the dead. But you look across the pond, and the UK and Russia and other parts of Europe, and they're literally milling about in areas where, like, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people have lived and died and lived and died, and you're literally drinking water that was used to bathe people millennia ago. And we're here,
Right.
and we're like, oh, fresh, clean, and for the most part, I mean, the Native Americans were here, but they were sparse. They weren't in vastly populated pockets throughout the entire country because this place is just so big. So, I mean, granted, where I am, we had a plethora of tribes, and out where you are, there were a bunch of tribes as well.
Right.
Yeah,
And they're
I
still
mean, here, not so much. I mean, they did a pretty
Right.
good job of wiping them out, sadly. But, they have casinos now, and they're taking it back.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's not, we just don't have that same, I don't want to say respect, because it goes even farther than respect. It's like,
I would say it's the
yeah,
intimacy with death or grieving, as so that process of being involved in the entire process. Like, even when someone is dying, we have industries to come in and take care of that for us. Exceptionally
Oh, yeah.
expensive at that. It's just heartbreaking how expensive that can be. But once someone dies, we come to the deathbed, we say our goodbyes, and then you call the mortician. And then they arrange everything. Now, it's not consistent across all cultures. Like, for example, I'm in Utah, land of Mormons, and several funerals that I know of, the mortician actually allows and people come in to wash the bodies and prepare them, because some of the people that are Mormon are what are called temple worthy. They've lived a life according to the doctrine of the LDS Church, and they're actually able to wear ceremonial garb and are blessed upon being buried in multiple different smaller ceremonies. But the family can come in and actually take care of the body. Now, this is something that I've had family members participate in, and they've expressed to me it helps them come to accept and to be have a little comfort in that, knowing that they were able to do that as a final service for their loved one. And the lady on Ask a Mortician has actually encouraged family members to do this when they felt like they want to. She says that baby boomers are starting to swing towards wanting more options than what were provided before. So you're starting to see things like coming in and preparing the body. One of my favorite things is ashes inside of glass, blown into glass.
It's pretty.
Fireworks, yeah. You can have a fireworks show with ashes, diamonds. They're starting to talk about putting bodies inside of pods and having trees grow from them. Which I would prefer to walk through a cemetery.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd love to walk through a grove. That would be, it'd be beautiful.
Right.
But I just sent that link to my wife about the diamonds because it just popped up when I was doing something. I don't know what it was, and I sent it to her, and she's like, "Okay, that's a thing. I don't think I like that."
What Lobo does?
Yeah.
Dead people in diamonds.
See, I mean, she's been with me for damn near 21 years now, so she knows what she's getting into. But she still, to this day, calls me, macabre and gruesome. And I just have to look at her slantwise, like, this isn't new territory here. This is something that you should understand. Yeah. But granted, she comes from a very puritanical family. Her family is from upper state Maine and part of New York. And then her mother's family is from Indiana. And, her mother's side of the family, very strict Germans. And father's side of the family, strict Englishmen. I'm like, okay, so you married me and I'm broken. So,
I wouldn't call you broken. I call you have a broader perspective of things than a strict German and English.
Thank you for that. But, she literally, let me think, her grandpa died. This is going to be the 6th year. August will be 6 years. And that's literally like the first person closest to her that's passed. Before that was Great Graham Thurston, and she died 3 days into our honeymoon. We were down in Aruba. We didn't even know we had fought the entire day. Like literally tooth and nail fought the entire day, and then got a phone call later in the day telling us that she passed. And we're like, all right, well, it makes sense why, there's just something up. You be, thousands of miles away, you still know when stuff's going down. But
yeah, I completely,
when the difference between my family and her family, other than the fact that I grew up in a cult, is my father's side of the family are all Roman Catholic. And I have literally been going to funerals and crawling over bodies since I was a small boy. I think I went to my first funeral when I was like 4. And then my grandfather killed himself when I was almost 9. So, and there had been a succession of people that died between 4 and 9. I think I probably went to like maybe 15 funerals between that time. And it just, the way I saw funerals, my parents were very much, this is what happens. People die. Granted, their idea of what happens after you die, to me, is complete malarkey. But I understand why they would want someone to be, I don't want to say comfortable. No, comfortable. There should be a certain amount of comfortability with the process. Not to the point where you're blasé about it, but, not fall apart. Like literally just fall apart. And when the tough one was, the hardest one up to that point that I had to sit through was my grandfather's. Now, he killed himself 3 days before my 9th birthday. And he had driven around to each one of us, our bus stops, to say goodbye. And we didn't know that at the time because, we didn't really speak to him very much. I mean, he loved me, but there wasn't a whole lot of communication. There was a certain language barrier between some of the kids. But I remember at his funeral, you know, already being the little morbid kid that I was climbing up onto the casket trying to figure out where the bullet entered. I wanted to see where it had come in and how they did a really good job patching him up. I mean, he didn't look like himself because he was very pale. But at that point,
and the corpse
well,
was never
he was a dark man. He looked like a little Aborigine in life. So he was really pale. They put a lot of makeup on him to be able to get him to look like not have a hole in your head. So I remember climbing up on that, and you know, the family was against me doing that, of course, as a child. But then I'm remember watching the other family members from the older generation like crying over him, like hugging him in the casket. Like, I'm like, okay, so it's not okay for me to be curious, but it's okay for you to like flop all over this dude. And then when they put him in the ground, I mean, there were literally people trying to jump into the grave. And I'm like,
wow, you've got a lot of display of grief there.
Well,
that
the funniest thing was, you know, I don't know about your family, but in my family, my father's side at least, when the people that do the least amount for the people when they're alive make the most noise, because there's like this certain level of guilt that they have no way to placate it now because the person's gone and they need to let everyone know how much pain they're going through.
Yeah, actually, speaking of that, that 21-year-old girl that passed, I was behind this woman. I call them hamster people, people that are so lost in grief and not being able to accept or express grief in an appropriate way. They come out with things that are truly bizarre. And this woman that was standing in front of me was, you know, crying and talking to this woman with her 21-year-old daughter in a casket next to her, saying, I know exactly how you feel. Number one thing you never say at a funeral. Because, wait for it, my pet hamster died last week.
Kidding me?
I'm not. She bawled onto this woman's shoulder saying that my 2-year-old hamster is the equivalent of your 21-year-old daughter. I completely understand what you're going through because I don't know what to do with myself now. And that's the kind of stuff that, like, 10, 15 years down the road, you're trying to get to sleep and you remember that one super cringy thing you did. I'm pretty sure that woman is like, oh God. I can't believe I said that. So there's just, there's a lack of being able to express, or especially with like the medical prolonging, pardon, I can't enunciate things to save my life. I've turned into row. There's this like prolonging of life that's artificial. And so death can sometimes be very foreign to people, like your wife. It's because we have so much access to medical sciences and morticians are able to make people look so lifelike. The idea of dead bodies or death, I mean, the only introduction we have may be through The Walking Dead or entertainment, and it's just so foreign to us that it makes me think of a quote from Albert Einstein. He actually had the option to get surgery to prolong his life towards the end, and he said, I want to go when I want to go. It's tasteless to prolong life artificially. I've done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly. And I thought, you know, that's a very, but it's a very foreign concept to us, because even when we hear about people that have, one case in particular I can think of is esophageal cancer. Once you get diagnosed with esophageal cancer, I've not heard of anyone surviving longer than a year.
My grandfather. He
did he really?
He did. My mother's, he was a nasty, mean, evil bastard, though. I mean, I think that's pretty much what kept him going. We had to feed him with a tube into his stomach because he could no longer swallow.
Holy cow.
And he lived for at least 5 years after that. But he was just a nasty, mean man.
By the power of bitterness, I shall continue.
And he smoked, and he smoked, and he had stopped, and he had emphysema and lung cancer and esophageal cancer, and literally, I mean, the only reason why he stopped drinking is because no one would put the liquid into his stomach tube.
Wow. So, all right then. That's the one case I can think of that, like, I've heard of people that get diagnosed, they're given 6 months to live. But there's a treatment, an esophagelectomy. I've seen that surgery in person, and they say it takes 6 months to recover, and it will give you an extra 3 to 4 months. So you spend 6 months recovering from one of the most brutal possible surgeries, where they basically cut out part of your esophagus and move your stomach up behind your heart. Or you die within those 6 months. I mean, people will opt to do it because they want to prolong life, because death is that much of an aversion.
See, I mean, I can understand if you were given that diagnosis and you had unfinished business that had to be taken care of, and the only reason you were doing it was to take care of that business. But just to prolong your life for a miserable 3 months after recovery, I can't personally see the rationale behind that.
And we have some incredibly brutal sciences that are not as advanced as one would hope at this point, but people will opt for it. And we have that incredible aversion to death. I'm not saying it's exclusively that. Like you pointed out, there are some people that it's a very serious matter that they need to take care of, and they need to remain alive. But at the same time, I mean, for example, actually, I can't think of an example. Ro, would you add that out?
Nah.
Anyway. So it's just, we have cultures all around the world where it's just an acceptance. It's a part of life. And and people tend to go far more quietly in the night, or the families are less prone to ask people to endure those kinds of things, and they just accept it.
Yeah, I don't, I can't say that I don't understand why we have this aversion to death, because it's just, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we just don't know. There's that fear of the unknown, and it can be crippling at times. But, I mean, every time and I think about it quite often, as I'm sure you do along the same lines with just those questions about life and death, is, what brought us to this point? What happened within our culture here in the States that caused that to happen? Was it the advent of the mortuary sciences? Was it the spiritualism movement that was here and big in the States? Is it Hollywood that's caused us to be terrified of the other side, or if there's another side, or if there's anything at all? What is it? What was that hallmark moment, that touchstone moment that caused us to say, okay, we don't want to accept this anymore. Now we're terrified of it, and we're going to do everything within our power to be able to prolong it as long as possible, no matter how miserable we are.
Right. And, maybe that whole idea that you just brought up ties into the fact that we don't want to be around death or near a body, because it reminds us of that ultimate mortality that we've, no longer come to accept. Particularly in the United States, we want it. We want the body buried outside town or away from us, even though that doesn't speak for all cultures and all groups, because that trend is leaning towards other ways. But I mean, for example, there are places all over the world where you can literally have dead bodies in the house, and that's completely normal. Like, we have an aversion when we hear about, I can't remember her name, but there was a woman that had her twin sister and her husband in the house. She was convicted of desecration of a corpse by having dug them up and brought them into the house. And she was lonely, and they meant the world to her. She wanted them in the house. And we in the United States are like, oh my God, that's vile. But for example, in Indonesia, there's a group, let's see, I'm going to butcher this, bear with me. The
Close
Mani,
enough.
M-A, yeah, the M-A, comma, N-E-N-E, where they will bring out the corpses once a year of their family members, clean them, dress them, feed them, parade them around town, have them sitting in the living room. You know, great Aunt Edna she really liked donuts, so she's got a plate of donuts on her lap, and you sit and enjoy her company. Death doesn't end that relationship.
Sure. I mean,
we just
no,
don't have that.
And
here.
you know, I can understand to a certain degree because, like I said, along the lines of the Hollywoodization of it. I mean, we have people like Poe, who wrote Bernice. You know, where that storyline is kind of creepy. You know, he had a relationship and didn't really want to get rid of her, even after she passed. You know, and that's, you know, we look at that and it's terrible to say, but I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole horror idea. Whereas, granted, I understand that there's a certain primal animalistic need to be away from rotting things. I mean, if you look at other primates, if there's a dead member of the troop, you leave the dead member of the troop and you don't go near it because, you know, it can carry disease. It can, you know, it can cause problems. It can even at the very least, it can give away your position to a rival troop. So they're moved away from, you know, the general area, and they're left to decompose. You know, same thing with ants. Ants take their dead and they bring them to a little ant graveyard away from the mound, you know, the colony, because it's going to cause problems. It can bring in fungus. It can bring in bacteria. It can they give off a certain odor that will draw predators to the area. I mean, there's even odors that are released from our bodies that are, one of them's called corpuscine, which is one of the notes in the odor that is what is an aversion to the majority of people. That is like, all right, we need to get this away from us. But initially, when a person dies, yes, granted, there's certain release of bodily fluids, and just have a few days before it gets really bad without any outside influence as far as embalming's going. But I mean, you're not, contrary to popular belief, you don't start stinking immediately. I mean, there is a particular odor of the dead. It's a death odor, but not, I'm not talking about the putrefaction process in that.
Right, which is separate.
You know, so I mean, I can understand the aversion afterwards, but initially, I mean, like you just stated, the people overseas that they dig up their relatives yearly, and they bathe them and they dress them and they bring them out for that set period of time, and then they reinter them. But where did that disconnect start here? You know, where was that initial, okay, that's just nasty, I don't want to do it anymore? Do you think it's because of the way we see ourselves as a quote-unquote civilized area? Or do you think it's deeper than that?
You know, honestly, I'm not quite sure, because as much as we like to associate ourselves with, as a whole, the Western world, my experience with Europe, with Canada, Mexicans, these Western societies, Americans are particularly averse to being around dead bodies and to grief. It's not something that they want to deal with. Understandably so, death is not easy to handle, but I think it goes beyond the body. It's just the idea of mortality that we want to avoid as much as possible, the prolonging of life. I mean, we're one of the only societies that will have, or nations that has advertisements for medications. So improve your quality of life, or we're fighting cancer and things like that. We don't want to conceptualize our own mortality. And I believe corpses, in a way, remind us of that. And that person is something that we can keep, like I mentioned before, digitally. So we don't want to be near a corpse, near those ideas. We want to remember them as they were. And these are things that earlier in American society we just didn't have access to.
Right.
We didn't have these medical sciences. We didn't have the means to be able to keep that person in the same way that we wanted to. And now we just have such ease of access. It's even gotten to the point where it's absurd, like funerary selfies. You've got people that are taking pictures with their grandmother in their open casket. We just have such an ease of access to that kind of a record that we just have this detachment. Actually, that would go against the idea of being away from corpses, wouldn't it?
I see. When you said funerary selfies, I always get thrown back whenever anybody says pictures of the dead or brings anything up like that. I'm always thrown back to the old tintypes and the old daguerreotypes that were taken of dead members of family. And the only way you knew that the person was dead is if you look closely at those pictures. Everybody else has a slight haze near and around them because it took so long for the plate or the daguerreotype to be able to take the picture that the normal movements in a living body show up as fuzziness around edges, whereas the dead person is completely clear and stock still in the picture. And unless you're really looking at the photo, I mean, if you just glance at it, you know something's off when you first look at it. But if you really sit there and you look at it, it gives a different level of, oh my God, what am I looking at? Because they're just not moving. And it was a necessity in certain instances, because some of these people that had these pictures taken, they were taken of babies, and they were not long in this world at the point of the photo being taken. So
and they were expensive.
Very expensive. So, and this would be the only way the child wasn't old enough to have grown to a point where another photo would have been taken, or there was no real, I don't want to say memory, because the day of your child's birth is a huge event, but you wanted something to hold on to as a memory of this person, this loved individual. Whereas now, I mean, you got kids taking pictures of their grandmother dead in a coffin. And I don't want to say that they're doing that out of disrespect, because I don't know if that's what they're doing, or if it's like just another challenge thing that's going on. But
honestly, I would say that it's more an indication of our self-centered society, where we're so focused on ourselves that we're even willing to take that kind of a selfie that blows funeral etiquette out of the water. That's another thing I'd encourage listeners to go look at if you just want to feel like you're the top of the food chain. Go look at these and feel disgusted. But yeah, I would open up that question to anyone to answer, because it's just such a complex idea. And, people like you and I that may have experienced death repeatedly early in life, why are we the weird ones for saying, this is a normal part of life? It happens. Mortality is what it is, and everyone else doesn't want to think about it, doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, it's very odd, and I've only really experienced this aversion in the United States.
Yeah, one of the other things that I wanted to touch on was the fact that here in the States, as well, I'm sure abroad, on my license, I'm a donor. And people look at that like one of two ways. In my experience, they look at it one of two ways. One, they're not going to rush to get you if you crash. And two, why would you want that done to your body? And, my boy Ice, when he passed, his corneas went to people. He had cadaver tissue that was given for ligaments and bone marrow. And I mean, he was literally every year we have a picnic for him in the park, and everybody that was close to him comes, and his mother has a poster board of anybody that was willing to give their information as far as receiving donor tissue from him. And he's helped a lot of people since he's passed.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have this stigma among some people, whereas why would you want to do that? As well as people that donate their bodies to science. You know, like, why would you want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it would be like, well, why wouldn't you want it? You're gone. You don't know any different. It's just meat at that point. And if it can help other people, why not?
Well, I can actually answer part of that.
That's why I asked it.
Potentially.
Yep.
Potentially. I'm speaking only from one point of view, very limited perspective. But being raised LDS Mormon, we were never encouraged to be on the organ transplant list. And the reason for that being is I was taught, and this is not necessarily canon for the religion, it's just part of the culture, that you cannot have any part of your body missing, because when the second coming arrives, you need to go collect every part of your body. So the less you have out there, the less work you have to do. So it's very strange, but I mean, the visual of a corpse coming out of the grave and being like, okay, my liver's in Bob, I got to go find Bob and get that back. It's a very strange thing, but I do believe that this is actually common across some other religions as well. And now this is a conundrum because, for example, the LDS in China, for example, they have to be cremated.
Well,
and so I believe the church has actually come out with statements about it's not really true. We have a God that will make you whole once you are resurrected. So, for example, if you get cremated, like I had an aunt that was apparently cremated, and she wanted to be released on the Hawaiian Islands out in the ocean. And I had family members that would tell me that she's going to come back and have to go to fish after fish and ask, when did you poop me out? I need to go find the rest of me. I had family members say that jokingly, but semi-seriously.
Okay.
So the idea of your body parts being in someone else, it becomes averse for religious and spiritual reasons. But, you know, like you, I'm a donor myself, but that's because I've seen people suffering needlessly when you could save a lot of people like your friend did. You could help a multitude. In fact, there's this beautiful picture of a hospital in China, I believe. It's a little boy that knew he had a tumor in his head. He was going to die. And the doctors are surrounding him and they're bowing because he opted to be an organ donor, and he saved, I think it was like 16 other kids. Right. So 16 other children were able to have a quality of life that would not be possible, even though that kid knew that they were going to die. So it's very strange that we want to keep our bodies whole, and we want this quality of life, and we want it always, and we don't want to think about mortality, even if it means not being near a body of a loved one. That's the general theme that I see in American society. And it may be present in others. I'd be interested to hear listeners that what their perspectives are, if they are a part of this group that's averse, or if they're not averse in their experiences. I'd love to hear that.
As would I. It's just I know growing up a Jehovah's Witness, you were allowed to do anything except take blood. They have this idea of the, you know, life is blood, and there's it's nonsense, of course, but you know, as you know,
right, that was actually
it's the strictness of religious doctrine can be quite absurd at times, but
right, like Prince, for example, he needed badly a hip replacement, but he wouldn't do it because it meant a blood transfusion. So he lived the rest of his life walking with canes, and as we know, opioid overdose took him.
Well,
unfortunately.
yeah. Well, I mean, unfortunately, See, now, I know my parents are still Jehovah's Witnesses, and they carry around, and I did at one point too, until I was like, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. A blood card, and it was a card that stated you were supposed to give it to your doctor, or someone was supposed to give it in your favor from your wallet. You carried it around with you, that you refused blood. You do not want blood. But they have also gone as far as to really push for more and better medicine, as far as blood expanders and a material that they started using years ago, that was a synthetic, like a plasma based, as opposed to, straight blood, which I'm a little leery about, because you literally have to spin the plasma out of blood in order to utilize it. But they were okay with that, which I don't understand completely. But you couldn't even store your own blood and use it. It was, once the blood left the body, that was it. It was never to return. And you cannot reuse you couldn't store your own blood. It wasn't a thing about other people's blood. It was blood in general. And I remember shortly after being kicked out that I went and had blood sausage just because I could. Because you're not even supposed to consume it.
Such defiance.
It's delicious. I have to say that it is absolutely delicious.
Yeah, I had black pudding in England. No, I was in Scotland. It was delicious, but my brain kept saying, "There's a reason you taste chocolate. There's a reason that it's very strong." I was just so disgusted by it, but it was delicious at the same time. I just couldn't cope. I couldn't even. There we go. I can't even. That's the best way to describe my experience with black pudding.
I've had numerous things throughout the years that I would never have been afforded the opportunity if I was still involved in that whole sect. But
right, and it's just an aversion to body parts. It's pervasive, and in so many different cultures, to the point where we won't even take care of our own loved ones. But that's turning around. I mean, like I said, baby boomers are looking for more options and seeing the kind of environmental damage a traditional funeral practice can have. I mean, it's something that hopefully you and I won't be looked at so crossly when we bring up the idea of options in the future.
I mean, you think about the amount of chemicals that are just leached out of your body alone over time. I mean, the embalming fluid that they put into you isn't made out of, unicorn poop. It's poisonous.
What? Yeah. I thought it was glitter.
I mean, if you look back at the mummification process that was used by the Egyptians and some other sects throughout history, the way they did it was, it took a very long time, but there was none of those chemicals that were utilized. There was salts that were used to dry the body out. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you're making a wrapped piece of jerky.
I was going to say, when you come out, you do not look like yourself, but you are preserved.
It is, and
it's remarkable. When I was younger, I used to love Egyptian mummies, and I thought, it's because they've been buried for thousands of years that they look like that. But then recently, an Egyptologist had someone donate their body, and that guy put this body through the same process, and he came out looking exactly like what you would see with Ramesses II, Tutankhamun, and the other mummies. They look like human jerky.
And that was did you watch that program? No, I loved it. I
did.
That was so good. That was so good. But I mean, in other essences, I mean, I understand that as we move along, we evolve and we want to do other things as far as preservation. But there was a huge gap between mummification preservation and our embalming practices. I mean, a gigantic gap. And now today we have cremation, which completely gets rid of the body as far as fire, and then goes through the cremulator to break up everything that's left over. And then we have, hydrolyzation, where they take it and they pump you full of an alkaline mixture, and that
I don't actually know that much about the chemicals.
That's a
that
good.
they
They
use.
take the body and they put it into a like a cavity, like a not a coffin, but it's like a tank, and they pump you full of the.
Mhm.
They pump the chamber full of I believe it's an alkaline mix, and then what's left over is it's essentially looks just like a cremation, except for the fact that it doesn't have to go through the cremulator because everything's been dissolved, and then it's just like dust. It's a fine powder when it's done. And then we do,
Right.
we have people that are being cryogenically preserved, which again poses other
Mhm.
problems. I mean, your cellular damage at a molecular level almost, where you're
Mhm.
if you had hopes of being brought back, you're going to have to overcome that hurdle of just the amount of destruction that the ice does, or the freezing process.
Yeah, I heard of a teenage girl in London, I think, in England, that just had this done because she wanted a chance to live again. So yeah, we have all sorts of things that are incredibly destructive that we're willing to do to separate ourselves from bodies or preserve them to avoid having to look at that putrefaction for the prolonged grieving process, I guess you could say.
I mean, you look overseas to the sky burials that are still going on. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, I don't know if I'd necessarily want to be the gentleman that has to, cleave the meat from the bones and be left out for the birds, but
Oh, there's a reason they
yeah,
pay
well,
alcohol.
we've discussed that on the show as well in the past. But it's the continuation of the life cycle. That's the way it's seen. Whereas here, it's not seen that way. It's over. That's it. We're done. And then we wait for some some final trumpet blast where we're either resurrected or we're on the other side and we're sitting on a cloud, or we're sitting in a fiery pit, or we're in some gray area where we can't go either way. It's that aspect of religiosity has been brought in as a factor here, where it's not the same overseas. So I mean, it's a dynamic animal here.
It's true. And it's interesting because that also extends beyond religion and to, for example, political power. If we look at Kim Jong-un, Ivan Perón, there are a lot of different political figures. Who else was that? Lenin, for example. They are all preserved to represent the power of that nation at one point or another that may want to be relived through whomever is in political power at the time.
Yeah. Well, look at Lenin.
Yeah, in the Red Square, I've heard it's exceptionally difficult to actually get in because they take such careful care of him that his tomb is only open so many days a year. So you may go there and you may not have access to the body because they're busy taking care of it. Oh, by the way, there is video of them showing how they take care of his body on another body that is not him. I think it's actually fake. You'll want to look that up. I think you'll be fascinated with that because I've always been curious how they take care. I will definitely
look into it.
But they're not averse. In fact, they use it as a power symbol.
I mean, look at this guy. He's not rotting. Yep.
He will remain forever preserved for the power of Russia, for North Korea, for Argentina. I mean, we have so many different nations that use bodies as power, but not the U.S.
Yeah, I don't. Well, they did try it though. They did try and have a preserved corpse moved around in a parade with Lincoln's corpse. Yeah, which I know that during the besides the Civil War era, they also had what the heck were they called? Stephen King speaks about it in Pet Sematary. Crud. It was a train that they would put all the bodies on, and then they would stop at each place to drop the bodies off. Crud.
What is that?
Yeah, it was.
Really?
It was. Oh crap. They didn't show the bodies, but when the people came back from the war, they'd put the bodies on these trains, and then the bodies were, each town that it went through, the bodies were unloaded for the family members from the town. Oh, crud.
Wait, I see something about London's Necropolis Railway,
No,
but that's not
No,
the
that was,
U.S. They would.
hold on a second. Now I'm going to have to look it up.
Inquiring minds need to know.
Yeah, because it was he spoke about it in Pet Cemetery, and I had to look it up when I was listening to it when I read it the first time, and then I was listening to it the second time. I had to look it up because I'm like, is this a real thing? And
I almost wonder if Stephen King has had had an effect on the U.S. with body aversion, because we've got Pet Cemetery, we have all these bodies just rising from the dead, so we want to get them away from us as soon as possible, almost drawing upon the fears of from Bram Stoker's Dracula and like vampirism. So let's see.
We have an aversion for, I think, a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, actually, it's the best conclusion I can think of.
I mean, I think it's a conglomerate of a bunch of different views and ideas and social stigmas that have all. It's a big stew, I think, of what's caused this to happen here.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. I hope to hear a lot more interpretations from anyone listening to this.
Okay. I can't. What the heck were they called? There was a name for it that struck me as strange the first time I heard it.
The Midnight
No,
Meat
that's
Train?
a great story. That's a Clive Barker story. That's awesome. you should watch
Lord.
that or read it.
My Google food is failing.
That's not good.
I know. I'm trying to find.
I think they were called mystery trains. I think they were called mystery trains. Yeah, I'm sure.
Wow. Yeah,
I'm sure Ro's ripping his hair out right about now.
Sorry, Ro. All right.
But yeah, they would literally go from town to town and drop off the bodies of people.
Is this from like
this was during the Second World War. This was during the Second World War.
Well, that makes sense.
Because I mean, the bodies were already at that point. You know, you didn't really have to worry so much about decomposition, because the bodies were already being embalmed at that point. Whereas during the Civil War is when our embalming practices really took off, because we had to wait so long for people to be brought back to their, prospective homes, and they wanted to try and preserve them as long as possible.
But as we know, in particular with like Lincoln, it was not a perfected art at the time, and there were people that would show up for the hours-long viewing, being able to wait in line, and you expect this great American eater, and it's a blackened, sunken corpse with powder all over it. So, yeah. You have to tell me if you think of what that train is.
It's killing me here. I think they're called mystery trains, because that's when he was talking about it, the main character, Judd Nelson or Judd Crandall, was he was talking about one of the characters that Timmy Baterman. He said he was put on a mystery train, and then one of the other character, Gage's father, what the hell was his name? Lou. Yeah, Lou, his father, Gage's father, Lou. He asked him, he stopped, and he goes, "Wait a minute, what is a mystery train?" And he explained to it, the kid, Timmy, had died on the road to Rome during the Second World War, and they put bodies back on the mystery trains, and I guess one of the last stops was in Bangor, Maine, because that was like, they dropped the bodies off to that area, and then you came in and you toted them away. That's when you took care of your own dead. You know, in that, as far as that was concerned, because you didn't necessarily up, you know, during the First and Second World War, up farther in New England, there was a population, but it was nowhere near as diverse, let's say, as it is now.
Right.
So,
all right.
I mean, it's interesting the way we've changed our views in such a. The thing is that the thing that really wanted, well, not really wanted. That's not the right term. That made me want to discuss this was the fact that it's changed so quickly here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is a very quick evolution from where we were literally sitting next to bodies, where we have them in our parlors, to, you know, we want this sanitized, quick delivery service, and we even want to run over graves with a riding lawnmower. We can't be inconvenienced to get off and even trim around the graves. We just can't be bothered. But, you know, once upon a time, and in other countries, it's an honor and a family practice to care for your dead.
Yeah, it's called a mystery train. It's on page 341 of Pet Sematary.
Wow, your Google food amazes me.
I'm not good at a lot of things, but
you got that. You can recognize hair in a wreath, and you can look up Stephen King references.
So what we've been on this for over an hour now. What do you take away from this? What's your final read?
Honestly, I'm still in a state of wonder, because I'm not someone that has this kind of aversion, and it's something that I've noticed broadly here, but not in other places. Well, I wouldn't say I'm completely immune to it. I mean, I did freak out about the idea of someone just digging in their backyard and finding a femur.
That's very true.
But, right, I can't have this elitist, I'm not like that, but I do have a certain amount of experience with death that makes other people uncomfortable, and as you can relate to that. So, I mean, we all have our separate experiences in life and our different belief systems. So it would be, I'm not so much taking something away from this as much as I'm curious what other people think and how they would articulate their own feelings.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, you know, because I always have questions. You know, I don't ever want to get to a point in my life where I think I know everything, because I did reach that point at one time and I ended up in a 12-step fellowship. So that really didn't work out that well.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, it is what it is, and we all think we find the answers, and then finally the words of Socrates make sense, where, you know, it's a wise person that knows they know nothing. And, you know, I'm just going to, maybe the one thing I'm going to take away from this whole discussion is not only the visual of a train delivering bodies, but a 9-year-old Lobo trying to look for a bullet hole in a corpse. So I'll take that.
I am a creepy bastard.
It's true, but I still appreciate you inviting me on to talk about this.
Thank you so much for coming on, Shelly. I'd tell you to plug whatever it is you have, but you're just a fan of like knowledge like I am. You know,
I'm just a morbidly curious bastard. I am the epitome of Michael Jackson eating a bucket of popcorn because I am just curious.
Well, I thank you for coming on and discussing this, I don't know, nonsense, enlightenment, whatever it was we just had. It was very enjoyable to be with a like-minded individual, to be able to speak about such things. And as always, you know, I know there's going to be no judgment from you. So...
Well, of course, and I hope this doesn't tank your ratings, because I'm just a curious
No, I doubt it at all.
bastard.
People love having you on Project Archivist, so I'm sure they'll love hearing from you here. So, thank you, Shelly.
Lobo.
Reminiscing on our indestructible days. The party never seemed to end. We donkey punched the night away. must have been. This glass I raise is heavy, heavy as my heart this day. The reaper slipped right past us, the mountain stole your breath away. The reaper slipped right past us, bastard stole your breath away. We raise a heavy glass to you in our indestructible days. Make heaven's call to you, may start the line and light your way. Sad and enjoyable toast to you. Heavy is my heart this day. Once more into the breach, dear friend. Don't get punched the night.